This evening, and we had some different questions. Some of those, I think you'll see which ones are a little bit different. And the first one is one of those. Will we have to have a micro? I didn't make the mistake. Get corrected. It's the plural. Will we have to have a microchip placed into our bodies? I have seen this on the nightly news twice now. This is a really interesting question. This, it seems to me, should be addressed as more of a symptom. And what I mean by that is there could be other things we could place alongside this question that would be an effect of a prior cause. What about this question? If the government says we've got to relinquish our guns, what do we do? If the government steps in and says X, Y, or Z, what do we do? This raises a bunch of thorny issues. But take a look at Daniel 3 and we'll make a statement that shows us a principle here. In Daniel chapter 3, we'll preface the entire discussion with this. Nebuchadnezzar sets forth these men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as their Babylonian names are, and tells them that they need to bow down before this golden image. Now, I understand there's a difference between that and having a microchip placed into your body. The difference is this: having a microchip placed into your body is not inherently wrong. Bowing down to a false god is. So I understand the difference between the analogy there. But nonetheless, in Daniel 3, these certain men do not bow down. So in 3:13, Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring them forth, and they brought them before the king. And in verse 14, he spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego? Do you not serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? And it says in verse 15, now I'll give you a second chance. We're going to play the music again, and when you hear it, bow down. And it says in 3:15, And who is that God, Nebuchadnezzar asks, that would deliver you out of my hands? In 3:16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, verse 18, Be it known unto you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Here's the principle I'm going for. Here's the principle I think we ought to operate under. No matter what happens, God's in control and we're going to serve him. And if the government gets to the point, which I'll make a comment on that here in just a brief moment, if it were to ever get to the point where it were so oppressive that they're demanding that microchips be placed into our bodies, I think that we need to go ahead and function under the principle of let's leave it in God's hands and just operate as Christians ought. Now I say this, I am extremely grateful to grow up in the United States of America. I have no problem saying that, and anybody in this country who does have a problem saying that, I would advise them to leave our country and go live elsewhere. And I'm very strong about that. I do not feel like they appreciate the freedoms that we have and have been fought for by our veterans and by people, whether it be in a polemic form, in debate, however it be. People have fought and died for our freedoms, and we ought to be appreciative of those things. Now, I'm eternally grateful for the U.S. Constitution, which also provides us freedoms. And I'm very thankful for the minds that were behind, especially the Bill of Rights, who set forward 10 amendments saying we're not going to have these freedoms infringed upon. And 2 of those being the right to bear arms and also the right to freedom of speech. I believe we ought to be extremely grateful for these things. Now, that being said, if it were the case that there were to be an uprising by the government, we ought to thank God for a document like the U.S. Constitution, which actually has within it phrases that gives the people, the citizens in the United States, to actually have an uprising. In such an uprising, that would actually be in harmony with the U.S. Constitution. It was that very document, along with the Declaration of Independence, that was started because of this kind of tyranny or dictatorship. And as long as America is holding to those values, the United States of America is holding to those values, I think we need to be thankful for the fact that we shouldn't be living under an oppressive society or system. Now, how does this relate to the Christian then? I believe, currently, that we are not at a state yet where the government has overthrown our religious values. Now, it may get to that point. And if it be the case that it does, in Acts chapter 5 and verse 29, Peter and the others answered and said, We ought to obey God in all things rather than men. So when it comes to the question about a microchip, my first thing would be, I would highly question whether or not that's even a reality that could come into our country. If it should be a reality, the second thing I would advise is we need to do some serious thinking and serious research on what the Bible teaches on a government's infringement upon ethics or morals as it's found in the individual. Here's my point. Somebody might say, well, the government could never get that far. The civil government could never get so far where it's infringing upon the morals or the values of the individuals within that society. Oh yes. Oh yes, they can. Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Nebuchadnezzar, Tiglath-Pileser, and a host of other lords are just examples of how this has happened in our past. If we are so naive to think that the government cannot uprise ever again, we've really got our heads in the sands. And so I think we need to be aware of these things and also consider highly the fact that when a government does infringe upon the rights of the individual, it is actually a moral atrocity for the government to go so far as to infringe upon your and my individual rights. So if it came down to the question of the microchip, I would do some more thinking. At this point, I don't see the need to do more thinking. But if this hypothetical were to ever be played out, I would really do some more research on whether or not I would have to follow such a law if that's commanded by God. I would venture to say it is not. Talk to me afterwards if you disagree. Question number 2. We've had a question like this similar in the discussion before. But does heaven have levels of reward or ranks of the individuals that will be there? I've given my opinion on this before, and like I said, that is my opinion. It's tricky to say. I've not seen anything that compels me, and maybe you've got the argument. If so, show it to me, show me a passage, and we'll do some thinking together. But I've not seen any compelling argument to think that there will be. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of texts that you generally get used for this sort of thing. But before we do that, take a look at Romans 1:16. Romans 1:16 is one of those passages we hear quoted quite a bit. And so you might already be quite familiar with that. But in Romans 1:16, Paul is writing to this church, the Latin church at Rome, and he tells them how conversion started in the early first century. He says in 1:16, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation. And he says that this salvation is to everyone that believeth, but watch who it went to first. To the Jew it went first, and secondarily it went to the Greeks. Now, if you're well acquainted with the book of Acts, that's exactly how it happened. In Acts chapter 2, the gospel goes to the people exclusively at Jerusalem that were Jews. In Acts chapter 6, we start to see those Jews who are cultured in the Grecian culture obeying the gospel. In Acts chapter 8, we have the first non-Jewish convert, the Samaritans. They were half-breeds. In Acts chapter 9, we have the conversion of Saul, one who was persecuting the Jewish body. And then it's not until Acts chapter 10 that we see the first Gentile convert. Now all of this, of course, is in harmony with what Christ had said just before he left this earth. When he said in Acts chapter 1 and verse 8, But you shall be witnesses unto me, beginning first at Jerusalem, and in Judea, and unto Samaria, and even to the uttermost part of the earth. And as you read the book of Acts, it plays out exactly as Christ had predicted. The gospel goes to the Gentiles, but quite secondarily. Now, how does this pertain to the present discussion about whether or not heaven has levels of reward? Take a look at Matthew 20. Here's the passage, one of them, that often gets raised about discussing levels of reward in heaven. And it says in Matthew 20 and verse 1, I'm going to have to paraphrase this for sake of time. But in Matthew 20, the parable is given. And it pictures a laborer, the owner, the master, calling forth laborers to come work in the vineyard, in the field. And so some of them come at the early part of the day. Some of them come a little later on, some in midday, some a little later on, and then some at the 11th hour. In the Jewish time frame, there are only 12 hours in the day, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And some of those come at the 11th hour, 5 p.m. And the text presents itself as they only worked for 1 hour. And watch what happens. In Matthew chapter 20 and verse 9, And when they came that were hired about the 11th hour, they received every man a penny. And so it says in Matthew 20 and verse 10, When the first came, they supposed, oh, well, we've been working all day and he just hired these guys on for a cent. Maybe we'll get about 12 times that. And then look at what the text says. In 20 and verse 11, when they received it, just a penny, they murmured against the goodman of the house. And they say in verse 12, these have wrought but 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us. And we've borne the burden and heat of the day. And he answered and said unto them, friend, I do thee no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a penny? And in verse 14 he says, take that which yours is, and go your way. I'll give unto this last, even as unto thee. Is it not lawful for me to do with what I will my own? And in verse 16, the parenthesis is there. So the last shall be first, and the first last. For many shall be called, but few chosen. Now why is this passage relevant? Some people have used this passage to say that as it goes in this life, some people come early on in their lives and obey the gospel, but some people on their deathbeds obey the gospel and we all receive the same reward. Perhaps that's the point, but in the context of Matthew, that is not, it seems to me, what he has in view. When he talks about the first and the last, it seems to me he's talking about Jew and Gentile. And so it seems to me this is not a discussion of heaven, not a discussion about equality of reward, but it seems to me it is a discussion about how the Jews had obeyed the gospel early on, and later the Gentiles received it. And so I don't think this would be an adequate text to deny different degrees of reward in heaven. There's one more text I'll look at, and these are not all of them. I understand there are several others, so the list I'm giving you here is not exhaustive. But take a look at one more passage with me, 1 Corinthians chapter 3. I think if there's a text that argues for reward in heaven, levels of reward in heaven, it may be this, but I'm very not convinced of that either. Take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3, beginning in verse 8. In this context, Paul is talking about the going forth of the gospel, and he's talking about different people evangelizing to different other individuals. And so he says in 3:8, now he that planteth and he that watereth are one, and every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor. For we are laborers together with God, and he's speaking of the apostles there. Ye, the Corinthians, are God's husbandry. Ye are God's building. According to the grace of God which is given unto me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, Paul says, and another builds thereon. But let every man take heed how he builds upon the foundation. Now he's going to clear some of this up for us. Take a look at 3:11. Who's the foundation? Well, he says that. Other foundation can no man lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. So Paul says, here's the foundation, and upon this foundation, Jesus, every man builds thereon. But what do they build? Watch what he says in 3:12. Now if any man, that's you, that's me, that's any convert, if we go out and we labor with another individual, we make converts. Now he uses a very figurative reading here. And he says in 3:12, if any man builds upon this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, every man's work will be made manifest or clear. When? Look at 3:13. For the day will declare it. The day is going to clear all this up. What day is he talking about? We'll come back to that. Because it will be revealed by fire. And the fire will try every man's work of what sort it is. When he uses the word work there, he's talking about the convert, the Christian that this other person has labored with. So to give an illustration, if I were the one doing the converting, my work would be Tim, who I have worked with for several years, and he obeys the gospel. Now Paul is talking about that convert. Did he really obey the faith or not? Paul says it's going to be revealed in the day. The day will declare what his work is. Now watch this in 14. If any man's work abide, which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. The one who did the converting will receive a reward. But in verse 15, if any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. What's all this talking about? We could take the common understanding that this is possibly the end of time and say what's going to happen is at the end of time, I and then this hypothetical convert will be standing there before the judgment seat. And if it's the case that this individual doesn't make it to heaven and goes to hell, I won't receive a reward. But if this individual goes to heaven, then I'll have a reward. If that's the case, the only amount of reward that would be experienced by the one doing the converting would be a mental joy because of the conversion. But I'm still doubting that that's what's in view in the context. Here's what I think he's talking about. When he says the day, in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 13, the day shall declare it. I think he's talking about a persecution, a fiery persecution. And there were several of those upcoming. Think about some of these. First of all, I'm told that there was a Corinthian war that was going on, a Corinthian civil war that was going on in their culture. The second thing you've got is Nero's persecution, which existed from 54 to 68 AD. You also have Domitian's persecution, which was just around the corner. And you also have, perhaps, the fall of Jerusalem, which had a Jewish war up leading to it, from 63 to 70 AD. So you've got 4 different possibilities of persecutions. I don't think Paul zones in on one of those. I think he says any of them fit. And the same is true then with you and me today. If persecution comes upon this convert that's been made, we're going to find out what he's really made of, aren't we? See, yeah, it was said of Christians are like tea bags. You don't find out how they really are until you put them in hot water. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. And I think that's the kind of thing that's being said here. Paul is saying you're going to find out when this person goes through a persecution of what caliber he is. In the case, Paul is saying, if you see this person remain faithful through the persecution, you'll have a reward for that. You've gained a convert. But if they fall away, there's no reward. You don't receive mental joy from watching this individual leave the faith. And perhaps that's what 1 Corinthians 3 is talking about. Not the last day, but any day of persecution which will reveal or declare what the work, the convert, is truly made of. At this point in my study, I have not found a passage that compels me to think there are rewards in heaven. If you've got one, like I said, bring it up later and we'll try to work with it. Question 3. How should I use logic to convince an atheist that God is real? With this question, you've really got to come up with your best arguments to prove that God does exist. So this is an apologetic question, of course. But you've got to come up with an array of questions why you believe that God exists. Turn over to Romans 10 and let me show you this passage. In Romans chapter 10, beginning in verse 14. Paul's preaching in this context especially. In Romans 9, 10, and 11, he has a unit. Those 3 chapters form a unit where he's arguing to his Jewish antagonists that justification truly came in the man Jesus. And so in Romans chapter 10, he's arguing for why he's been preaching the gospel the way he has been. It differs from Judaism. Judaism was looking forward to an era of fulfillment, and Paul now is saying that it has experienced fulfillment. That's quite different. The Jews wanted to still look for a Messiah, as he had formerly said in the same chapter, Romans 10. Well, Paul is now saying that the Messiah has come in the person Jesus. So in Romans chapter 10, 14, he asks these questions. How will they, whoever they're preaching to, how will they call on him in whom they've not believed? If you and I don't believe Jesus came out of the tomb, we're probably not going to call on his name, are we? That's his point. In 10:14 he goes on, and how will they not believe in him of whom they have not heard? If you don't know about the man, how do you believe in something you've never even heard of? How do you call on something you've never even heard of? And how will they hear without a preacher? See, the gospel needs people to proclaim it. And then he says in 15, and how will they preach except they're sent by somebody who gave them the tidings to preach? And he says, as it is written, he quotes from Isaiah, how beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of peace and bring glad tidings of good things. They've not all obeyed the gospel. Isaiah said, Lord, who will actually believe our report? And then here it is in 10:17. So then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. How do you convince an atheist, using logic, using whatever means you can find that are adequate arguments, how do you convince an atheist that God is real. The first thing you've got to do is be convinced yourself that God is real. If you're not convinced that God is real, you're going to find a hard time convincing or converting somebody else to that thesis. So we've got to do some work first on our own selves in thinking of what must it take for me to be convinced that God is real. If somebody asks me that question, I've got five arguments. The first one being the argument from design. We often call that the teleological argument. And what that means then is, let me quote to you Hebrews 3:4. For every house is builded by some man, but the builder of all things is God. There are two arguments in that text, Hebrews 3:4. The first one being the argument from design. When you see a blueprint for a house and you see the house being built exactly like that, you know a designer was behind the thing. There had to be a brain, a mind behind it. And because we see intricate design in our world, we know there had to be a designer. Design demands a designer. That's a first argument. A second argument for God's existence is that we must accept the cosmological argument, the argument from cause and effect. If we see a ball rolling through the stream, we understand that that is the effect. But it demands us to think back, who put it there? Where did this ball come from? Maybe the wind blew it. Maybe somebody dropped it there, kicked it there, pushed it there, whatever. We know that that ball didn't just get there on its own free will. We know that there had to be a cause behind the effect. And so we have the cosmological argument, a second argument. A third one, I'm not going to belabor this one. Do your own reading in your own time. But the ontological argument demands that there must be a being that transcends everything in the natural world. And I could embellish that further if we had the time. But the ontological argument is a third argument that I would argue from, demanding that a God, I'm not arguing for the God of the Bible at this juncture, but a God must exist. A fourth argument, and perhaps my favorite, is the moral argument. Every atheist knows Hitler was wrong. Some of them really felt pushed to deny that and say, well, Hitler actually wasn't wrong. Why? Because if you have morals, values, ethics, it demands a moral lawgiver. And only the most radical of atheists have gone to the extent to say Hitler was not wrong. The fact that people still feel the need to say there's something tragically, morally wrong about what Hitler did demands that somebody somewhere else beyond you and me is calling the shots about what's right and what's wrong. We call that person, that being, God. And then a fifth argument, I do not have time to present this one, is Thomas B. Warren's birth or transformation argument, which I would argue demands that God exists, and it is unsurmountable to the atheist. More time later, we might deal with that in a different setting. But anyway, there are 5 arguments. In order to convince an atheist that God is real, you've got to be committed to that. And you've got to know how to prove God exists. So I would say the first thing we need to do is do our own homework, really put in some time and effort into knowing how we can defend God's existence, and then proceed accordingly. Question 4. This is very similar. How should I proceed the process of evangelism with an atheist that is interested in reading about religion and debate? Same way I would answer the last question. First, become committed to the thesis that God is real, be convinced of it yourself, and then try to work forward. And so I would work with an atheist that way. There are some good tools. I'll give you a couple of names of those that I would strongly recommend on the atheist question. Thomas B. Warren had a debate with Antony Flew in the year of either 1984 or 86 on the university campus at North Texas State. And you can watch that on YouTube, and I would highly advise it. This is the leading professor of philosophy of the day over in London. Antony Flew flew over to the United States, and they had a debate. And to put it kindly, Warren ate his lunch on the question about whether or not God exists. Do your own reading, do your own research, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Watch it on YouTube. Now, I will warn you, if you start to watch Antony Flew lecture, you'd rather watch paint dry. Warren does an extremely good job. He was a preacher for the Churches of Christ for several years. Friends with Garland Elkins, Curtis Cates, and several others. Had a PhD from Vanderbilt in philosophy. Excellent brain. Any of his works would be highly beneficial to your reading. Question 5 then, and I believe this is the last one. What is the best way to share the gospel with a denominational person that claims to be a Christian? Whenever we approach evangelism, there are 2 things we've got to keep in mind. The first one is we need to know our stuff. We need to know our stuff. I've seen too many people, and this is a criticism not about passion, not about energy, but this is a criticism about knowledge. I've seen too many people in the Lord's church who want to preach, they want to fill the pulpits, they want to do the devotional, they want to talk to people about the gospel, but they have no clue about it. That is a problem. That is a problem. I read an article by a denominational person a couple months ago, and he argued that one of the things that is driving people away from the church is bad theology, as he called it. Look, whether we like it or not, bad answers can hurt us. Bad answers can drive people away from the faith. And so we've really got to pour our time and energy into making sure we've got good answers. If we have bad answers, we can harm people in the process. And that comes back then to us demanding that we really put the time and effort into study. Bad answers don't help. I say that, and I say this as well. Anybody who's been driven away from the Lord because Drew Leonard gave a bad answer isn't going to fare well on Judgment Day by blaming Drew Leonard. You see my point? It's not going to do for me to stand on Judgment Day and say, well, God, my parents didn't teach me well. That's not going to do. We're responsible as individuals, and we've got to go ahead and accept that individuality and be responsible accordingly. The second thing I would highly stress comes from 1 Timothy 4:12. Take a look at this. If you're going to do personal work, you're going to do personal evangelism, the first thing you need to do is be well-trained, well-equipped for a defense of the gospel. The second thing I would advise is having a good example. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12, Paul says, "Let no man despise your youth, but be an example of the believers in word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, in purity." The quickest way, again, to drive somebody away from the truth is by not living it out. Maybe some of you have children, grandchildren, friends, neighbors, relatives, such as brothers or sisters or parents who haven't come to the truth. And if you ask them why, it may be the case their number one answer is because so-and-so I know goes to that Church of Christ and he's not living right. Now that's not an argument. It's not. If you're looking for people that are flawed at the Church of Christ, you know what? You're going to find them. You know why? Because the text says Jesus came to save sinners, not the righteous. If you're looking for perfect people in the Church of Christ, you're not going to find them. If you're looking for people who are perfectly fit at the gym, more than likely they've been going to the gym for a while. People who aren't fit at the gym don't keep us from going to our workouts, do they? Some of us don't go to the gym anyway. I know Randy does, isn't that right? The quickest way to drive people away from Christianity is by leaving the impression that we're not real about it. We've got to be real about it. We've got to demonstrate to people we really mean it. And I think by setting a good example, maybe that's the best way of evangelism in the first place. You know why Jesus drew the crowds? You know why people started coming to Him? There was something about Him. He wasn't just this moral anarchist. He wasn't just preaching something new and everybody wanted to jump on it. But He was really one that demonstrated to the people He was one with God and He could bring them closer to Him as well. I'm convinced that if we're Christians and we care about telling the lost that they're lost, then we need to do two things. We need to live it, and we need to be bold about our message. We need to be fearless. That means that even though sometimes we have certain propositions within the churches of Christ that aren't tasteful, we still hold to them. What I mean by that is, I don't like saying that there's a hell for the non-believer any more than you do. I don't like that. But if I'm a Christian, I better believe it. I don't like telling somebody they're lost. There's nothing more in the world that I hate than telling somebody who is sincere, somebody who is kind, outgoing, telling them you are not on your path to glory. How do you nicely evangelize? I really don't know. I really don't know. You can befriend those people. You can spend time with them, have them to your house, eat dinner. But at the end of the day, you are ultimately getting down to one thing. You are not saved if you are not in the body of Christ. And even though that's something we don't necessarily like to say, it's a thesis that we must hold to if we're Christians. There is one true church, and the minute we become familiar with the tenets that are set forth in the New Testament, and we believe that, then we're prepared to tell people in love, come to Christ, come to know who He is, and come live the gospel experience with us as we proclaim His death, burial, and resurrection every Sunday. This evening, if you're not a child of God, we would encourage you to do the same thing. We would encourage you to look deeper at what Christ did and what He can do for your life as well. By hearing His gospel, Romans 10:17, believing in Him as coming out of the tomb, John 8:24, by repenting of past sins, Acts 17:30 and 31, confessing Him as Lord, Romans 10:9 and 10, and being baptized into His kingdom, John 3:5, you can be a New Testament child of God. If you're outside of the body of Christ, become one this evening. If you're in the body of Christ, but you've erred and you've walked away, you need prayers of encouragement. Whatever your needs may be, won't you come forward while we stand and sing?
Oh, do not let the word depart, and close thine eyes against the light. Oh,